Welcome to the Ottawa Business Journal's live broadcast of Working Hard or Hardly Working, Managing a Partially Remote Workforce. I'm Michael Curran from the Ottawa Business Journal. Thanks for joining us today. As we kick things off, I've got to acknowledge that's the funniest headline we've had for any of these live events. A little bit of levity, especially on this topic, which is getting so political, is a very good thing. As you know, the COVID-19 pandemic made working from home much more widespread. However, the feasibility of continued working from home can vary depending on the nature of an employer's operations. The practice of working from home can also raise various employment-related issues for employers to navigate. That's what we're here to talk about today. It's important for employers to understand their rights and obligations when it comes to working from home, especially, as I said, given the fact that this has gotten to be a very hot topic with lots of people and lots of opinions. Today's podcast will bring some of the answers to these questions, such as, is working from home a privilege or a right? Can working from home be required as a duty to accommodate? And how performance management and discipline issues play into this. As always, we have a great tandem of legal experts from Emond Harnden LLP, our frequent partner in these broadcasts. Founded in 1987, Emond Harnden has the largest group of lawyers specialized in labor and employment law in the national capital. They lead from even a country point of view. So these really are the best experts you can hear from, particularly for those people in Ottawa. Now, backed by popular demand, here are two of Emond Harnden's finest. First up, we have JD Sharp, a partner at the firm. Hello, JD.
Michael, how are you?
I'm doing great, and I can't wait to explore all of this with you. I think.
Well, after that introduction, I'm sure we can't fail but to disappoint.
Yeah.
So, let's get at it.
Yeah, and you're not carrying the load alone
No.
there, JD. We have also joining us Negeen Yazdani, an associate with the firm. Welcome to you, Negeen.
Hi, Michael. Thanks so much. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, it is nice to see both of you are back by popular demand, as I said. JD, let's just start with a little bit of context for this. So, remote work from home, whoa, super political.
Yeah.
Everyone has an opinion. I think this is particularly timing because of the federal government recalling its employees to the office more frequently. But JD, I'm sure you would agree, opinions don't constitute employment law. Give us your thoughts on that.
That's absolutely correct. Although opinions, everyone having their own opinion is apparently good for the legal business for most people. But it's essentially what we are looking at, and you're absolutely right. This is a politically charged topic, and it's certainly one that's getting a lot of conversation, especially if you live and work in the National Capital Region. You're seeing a lot of the federal public service discussion going on. And it's important to remember that's one employer. That's one employer with one set of rules, one set of rights, one collective agreements that govern that particular environment, a labor code that governs that environment, et cetera. So what we want to talk about today is the more broad legal rights that exist and how that plays out. And I should disclose before we start this, I have a very personal interest in this topic. I spent 3 years in my basement, 15 feet from the kitty litter. I know more about the bathroom habits of my 2 cats than I ever wanted to. So I was very keen to return to the office, but I know it's not the same for everyone.
Oh, that's hilarious. Thanks for setting that up. A great point, JD, that not all work places are the same. Some are radically different. For example, the federal government and a private sector company. Negeen, I would presume this is something that you're getting questions on at Emond Harnden. Your clients are coming to you and say, we're post-pandemic now, but we're still not sure what to do, and we need some legal advice. Is that right, Negeen?
Absolutely, Michael. We've been working with our clients during all stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, starting back in 2020. And certainly today, the focus of employers' efforts has been kind of whether and how to ask employees to return to the workplace. So, as we'll discuss, Michael, the answer to those questions and our recommended approach really varies on a case-by-case basis, depending on the workplace. But certainly it's the focus of employers today.
Yeah, we always have a good topic in these live broadcasts, but this one I think is going to hit home for a lot of people. So let's give everybody a sneak peek at today's agenda. So first up in topic number 1, we'll talk about working from home, a privilege or a right. Topic number two, can working from home be a duty to accommodate? That's something, duty to accommodate, we've talked about in a lot of these online videos. And number 3, addressing performance and discipline issues, which become a little bit more complex when you've got a hybrid or remote workforce. And sometime around 12:25 today, for our live viewers, you'll get to ask questions of our legal experts. A reminder, whether you're on YouTube or LinkedIn or any other social platform, you can use your social platform to ask us questions. We get all of those kind of in a central way on our broadcast platform, and our behind the scenes assistant Susan will be sorting those out, and we'll deal with those. But don't be shy to get those questions in early as JD and Negeen are presenting. All right. Without further ado, let's go to topic number 1, which is the big one to set the foundation of all this. Negeen, you're going to start. It's working from home, a privilege or a right? Over to you, Negeen.
Thanks, Michael. So you hit the nail on the head earlier. Really, the pandemic has really completely transformed the workplace for many employees. And I think we're not surprised to hear that as part of this, there's been a really significant increase in remote and hybrid work arrangements as compared to before the pandemic. So one of the things we want to think about is that a privilege or a right? So we can say in general, there's going to be a couple of caveats we'll cover in the presentation, but in general, employers do have the right to dictate where employees work, and this includes requiring remote workers to return to in-person work in the workplace. And so one of the caveats I was referring to earlier is we'll have to take a look at whether there's any direct or implied contractual terms that say otherwise. Additionally, we'll have to take a look at whether there's a required accommodation under human rights legislation. So, Michael, we say in general because it's going to depend on these things, particularly the employment contracts, the policies, what types of things have been promised to employees at the start of the pandemic. In addition, in unionized workplaces, we'll have to take a look at what the collective agreement says. This is, the document that's negotiated with a union and really outlines the terms and conditions of employment. And we'll want to take a look at whether remote work is covered in the document. And now, some of these collective agreements that were negotiated before the pandemic, they may be silent on the topic of remote work, but we may see, and in fact, we have already seen that the topic of remote work has come up in negotiations for renewing collective bargaining agreements. So all that to say, Michael, it's very topical. It's very important. Rightly so, it impacts employees and it impacts employers just the same. So it's an important issue. But to summarize, Michael, it's a privilege, not a right.
Okay.
And as Negeen has said, that right versus a privilege, a lot of that is going to be dependent on either the collective agreement, maybe the terms of employment of an individualized employee in their employment agreement. Somebody you may have hired in 2022, you may have included a provision in their employment agreement, for example, that may create a right that you didn't necessarily intend to create, or you may not have intended it to be forever. So again, you'll have to examine the wording of, for example, that particular provision. We are seeing it, as Negeen says, we are seeing it definitely in collective bargaining. It's becoming a topic. It's becoming a specific proposal from the union in many cases. So those are types of things that employers are going to have to pay attention to. And we have to also look at promises that were made. We have to look at things that happened during the pandemic. Obviously, in the early days of the pandemic, everyone's just trying to get up and running and keep the business going. Everyone, decamped necessarily to remote sites where and when they had to or could. Some businesses obviously couldn't operate remotely, but some had to. And so, what was set? For example, did the employer put out a policy about remote work? That applied during the pandemic? Did they make broader promises? Did they say, you know what? Nobody's ever going to be required to come back to the office. Don't worry about it. You'll see your employer. Maybe they dropped their office space. They said, we're not going to have office space anymore. Everyone's going to work from home. Well, there's a very different response to an employee who may have moved to Kingston to be closer to family under a promise that they would never have to come back to the office, versus somebody who just made that choice because they said, hey, well, it looks like it's going to be going on for a while. I'm going to move down to Kingston and be closer to my family. Those are two very different scenarios. And those are the types of things that you have to look at. And, we also get into the law versus pragmatism for employers, right? Do you have to offer some form of remote work to recruit and retain? Does that make you more competitive in the market? Does that make your business run better? Did productivity go up or down during the pandemic, during remote work. Some businesses who dropped office space, for example, saw overheads fall. And if they didn't see productivity fall, if they saw employee engagement remain the same, presumably that business is more profitable, more successful, or more, or in a social service agency example, more able to provide more services. So, is it all necessarily bad? Not necessarily, but that's the type of thing that has to be taken into account on an individualized basis.
Cool. One of the things that are super about these broadcasts, by the way, is you're teaching me. So I'm going to reiterate some of those things back, JD, and maybe I'll ask this question of you. So let me just see if I can pose it correctly in my head. So imagine that we're talking about a private workforce, so a private, not a unionized environment, and pretend that this is an employment contract that's pre-pandemic and that does not promise someone that they can work from home, for example. And also, I'll add on what you just said there, that during the pandemic, there was no sort of company-wide decision to shut down the office and never return to office. So with all those parameters, let me try to ask the question. If an employee comes to an employer, a private sector, again, given all my parameters, and says, I've been working from home for 5 years, you don't have the right to ask me to get back in the office. You would say to that employee, wrong, I think.
Get on the bus. We'll see you here tomorrow.
Okay.
Again, depending on the nature of the promise that was made, the communications, right? And that's where, unfortunately, it's good to have a podcast like this where we can talk in these terms and give everybody a sense of it. But you really do need to take a look at the individual. Like if there was a company-wide communique put out saying, we don't reasonably foresee the option of ever returning to the office.
Yeah.
That's very different from for the time being, ... So that's where you really have to dig into the message. Anything that was put out in writing, anything that was given individually. If an employee came to you in 2022 and said, I'm thinking of leaving, I want to do the following. I don't ever want to have to come back to the office. And you said, no, stay, because everyone's having trouble finding qualified and good people. No, stay. We can work this out. We'll make sure you don't have to return to the office. You have maybe created a right that's a problem for you now.
And Negeen, I'll ask you a quick follow-up too. And I'm just trying to sort this out, trying to think, what is the audience wondering? So if someone were to say that, that you do have the ability, again, given all those parameters, to ask them to work in the office. And maybe I'm skipping ahead here a little bit, but Negeen, if someone decided and there was, the employer thought and had proper legal advice that you were within your rights to recall the employee to the office, if they don't comply, I know that's probably a whole other podcast, but generally, what would an employer start thinking at that point? Boss, I'm not coming back to the office. I hate being in the office. I'm not coming back. You're talking to the employer, Negeen, and you say,
Yeah, Michael, those are certainly challenges. And one of the things that JD and I routinely advise on is, we're there to advise employers on their obligations, on their rights. But there's certainly other strategic and other cost benefit analyses that employers have to take, and that's where it's really a challenge. We can say, this is the law, but really on the ground, boots on the ground, practically speaking, there's a lot of considerations employers have to take in terms of, do we want this employer around? Are we worried about retention? What are our, there's other metrics beyond, certainly we want to comply with the law, but it's not easy for employers to manage the competing interests. Certainly,
you've taught me that well. So it's like the employment law, and then it's the strategic HR decision layered on top of employment law.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, listen, we're going to move on to topic number 2. Before we throw things to you, JD, I just want to remind everyone I have this great privilege of asking all these questions. You do too. If you're watching this live, you can use your social media platform to ask some questions, and we'll get to those in about 15 minutes or so. Topic number 2, JD, is, can working from home be a duty to accommodate? Maybe explain, of course, as you will, what duty to accommodate means.
Yeah, duty to accommodate arises under the Human Rights Code, whether the federal Canadian Human Rights Act, Ontario Human Rights Code, or any of the provincial codes that exist in terms of human rights. And they set out a list of prohibited grounds in terms of the grounds of discrimination, disability, family status being among a number in there. Obviously, there's a great list that's contained in the legislation. I would say that we see disability and family status being the two primary ones that we talk about when we talk about the duty to accommodate and working from home, remote work, et cetera. So we're proceeding with the basis that, let's say we've established the employee doesn't have any other right to absent themselves from the workplace and work from home. They don't have the contractual right. They don't have anything. The question is, can working from home be required as a result of the duty to accommodate? The short answer to that is yes. I guess if I stop there, the rest of the slide might be a little, a little murky. But yeah, the short answer is yes. Anybody who's ever had to deal with the human rights duty to accommodate issue knows it's a constant gray area. There's always these factual nuances that go on with each individual situation that you have to consider. But as I say, we see prohibited grounds of discrimination of disability and family status being the two main ones. So the first question is when an employee comes to you and says, I need to work from home, or I want to work from home. And you say, well, you don't have any right and we're having everybody come back. Well, the next thing they say is, I have medical condition that means I have to work from home. So now we're into the standard duty to accommodate discrimination type analysis, where you're trying to then gather evidence. What can this employee establish to tell you medically that they do in fact need to work from home? What is the difference in working from home versus working from the office that will make this health difference that they're seeking to address, and that their doctor will provide information for? So you have to launch into the full inquiry in terms of, okay, well, why? What's the medical behind it? Family status, the same thing. What part of your family status is obligating you to work from home as opposed to from the office? What's changed? What's the circumstances? And so these things are, um, they're complicated issues to deal with in the workplace. But you start with the gathering of evidence. You start with gathering information that will help you figure out, is there a medical reason? So, for example, you've got an employee who says, "Well, I can't really drive anymore." Okay, and you say they've got medical, saying they've had their license removed because they've got a medical condition. Well, there's a couple of different ways to look at that. And if the employee is employed as a driver for you, or if during the day they have to do certain things, well, then yes, there may be a medical issue arising from that. But if they come to the office, they work 8 to 4, 9 to 5, and they're on the phone with clients all day, or they're on their laptop interacting with clients all day, you don't need them to drive. All you need them to do is get to work. So the fact of maybe having a driving issue with not being able to get to work might not be the answer. If they can take public transit, that's a different issue. So there's all these things you have to look at. Same with the family status type obligations. Are you do you now have a child under school age that's at home all day and you don't have any daycare? Well, then we've got standard kind of family status duties to accommodate that we look at, and there's tests there, and Negeen will speak to those a little bit, in terms of how you do this analysis, what the tests are that will give you an idea as to whether you're getting the right place. And the human rights legislation prohibits discrimination, but it's whether this is a preference that the employee is expressing, or whether it actually engages a human right, whether it's actually going to create discrimination if you say no. So that's the difference. If the employee just says it would be easier for me if I work from home, well, that's not a human. That doesn't engage a human right. If the employee says I have a medical condition or I have a certain family status obligation, that will create that, that can create the right, and obviously then you have to do the analysis. And the duty to accommodate, once you, let's say they establish that they've got a medical condition that the workplace for some reason is engaging their allergies or something like that is causing all these problems. Okay, well, now we have the medical. Now we do the duty to accommodate. And the duty to accommodate is it a bona fide occupational requirement for you to be in the workplace? It is very difficult for a hospital nurse in the ER to work remotely. They're not very useful for you from that. If you have an accounts payable clerk who can work entirely remotely and has worked entirely remotely without issue throughout the pandemic, then it's harder to say now we can't accommodate that. That might be undue hardship for us. However, again, if you've got evidence that productivity has gone way down, if you've got evidence that it's confidential material, it's off-site, that's not protected, there may be issues that you can argue undue hardship with, and that's really the type of analysis you get into, and a very standard duty to accommodate analysis that's no different just because it's remote work. You still have to have some grounding in a human rights piece of legislation in terms of it engaging a discriminatory issue, and then the elements that go along with it. And Negeen, you've got some of the kind of tests that you can maybe lay out for people so they've got a better idea.
Yeah, absolutely. So, again, the definition of family status or disability or the other protected grounds in the code are fairly broad, particularly when it comes to disability covers a number of physical, mental, developmental, a number of things. What's key really though in the analysis is that um, there has to both be an adverse impact at work experienced by that individual, and the fact that they are, if it's family status, a parent or a child, and or if it's disability, the fact that they have that disability, it has to be a factor in that adverse treatment. So the two really have to uh, be connected. And so only when that kind of prima facie, discrimination is made out, the onus then flips to the employer. And there's a number of things the employer can establish, which JD has talked to us about, which is, is there, occupational requirement? Is there undue hardship? Is there a reason we can or cannot accommodate? But really, again, it's not, this is my ideal accommodation and that's why you have to give it to me, or this is my preference and therefore I'm owed it. It's really, I'm a member of I have a characteristic that's protected by the code. There's an adverse treatment that's being that I'm experiencing as a result of that, and then only then do we look at whether there is a duty to accommodate without having without experiencing undue hardship on the part of the employer. So there's a number of considerations there.
And I think just to kind of finalize this accommodation piece is, I think it's important to remember that the pandemic gave us basically a 3-year evidence trail, right? If an employer says we absolutely cannot tolerate anyone working from home, if they did it for 3 years very successfully, there's at least a bit of an evidence trail there. The employer is going to have to take a harder look at the duty to accommodate if it arises, if it's actually valid. They will have to take a look at it. You can't just dismiss it out of hand and say everybody works from the office now, that's what we do. When somebody can say, well, for 3 years everybody worked from home and the business is still there, can you show me any detrimental effects on service, on clients, on this, on that? And if you can't, or at least if it's very weak, then you've got an issue that you have to deal with. And so that the ideal thing in every duty to accommodate situation, whether it's work from home or anything, is to really do a full analysis of the situation, what you can and what you can't handle, and what would constitute undue hardship. Health and safety is one of the primary undue hardship defenses. Like if it's going to hurt somebody or if it's going to put somebody at risk, I'm always going to tell my client that that's a problem with that's an undue hardship. But you have to do that analysis in good faith to have a trail and an evidence trail.
It does seem, as you're saying, like it's a thorough analysis in this topic too for duty to accommodate. Topic number one, whether it's a right or privilege, almost, if I were to summarize, seems like let's go check the paperwork and what's been communicated to that. And this one seems a little bit more complex
Yeah.
because you got to work this through. You've got to consider all these alternatives. And maybe just one quick follow up. I think I know the answer, but the duty to accommodate sometimes can mean even switching people in a job, right? Like, okay, you can't drive anymore because you've got a heart condition, and you were a driver for a number of years, but so we're going to try to make you a accounts receivable clerk. Does the duty to accommodate go that far sometimes,
Oh
JD?
yeah. Well, the duty to accommodate is basically, it's kind of like a hierarchy. The first thing you're trying to do is make the necessary modifications for the person to do their job, the job they have. And then if that's not possible, then you do have to look organization wide. Now, it doesn't mean that you necessarily take the accounts payable clerk and say you're out of a job, you either have to go drive a truck now. But the next opening you may have in accounts payable, and this is where the duty to cooperate by both unions and employees arises as well. They may say, I don't want to do accounts payable. Well, that's the only job we have for you that will work. So that's where we're going to put you. And the union may say, no, you have to post jobs. You can't do this. Well, for accommodation purposes, sometimes the union may have to waive a provision of the collective agreement. And again, that's going to be your last resort. You're not going to go to that as the easy solution. You have to try and do the other things first, especially in the hierarchy, to maintain that employee in their own employment. You need to look for those solutions. You can't just go, well, the easiest thing is to swap these two employees over. The union can just waive the collective agreement. No. You first have to do the rest of the analysis. And if that's the only thing that's left, then you go and have that conversation.
That concept of a hierarchy is very helpful to me. I don't know if it's helpful to the audience in understanding that. So, first, can they continue doing that job? How can we accommodate? And then if they can't do that job,
Because it can become too easy, right? Like if it's just a minor little problem in the workplace, it's the easiest thing to overcome. But you go, well, I'll just move them over there. Well, you're going to have to justify why you did that and why you didn't undertake that $5 solution.
And I thought it was really interesting, your point on, a business or organization not being able to say working from home doesn't work if they were working from home for 2, 3, 4 years during the pandemic, and their business organization was still operational and they were getting things done. That's a really interesting
Yeah.
point, that you can't just reject it outright.
No, and again, we're talking about it again only in the context of duty to accommodate there, because if you don't have the other right, if you don't have that right to accommodate, the employer can still make that decision, as we've said. But it's that notion of your evidence trail that's already there. We're already seeing, and we even see it internally here. As I said, I was in my basement for 3 years. I missed talking to Negeen, walking by Negeen's office and having a chat about a file we're working on, or hearing about a file she's working on, which gives me an idea for a file I'm working on. I don't think there's really any debate that having us all in the office, having people in the office, creates those conversations and creates a synergy and creates, the sum is, sum's greater than the parts, in that, you have a bunch of smart people in a building. Well, when they talk and when they share ideas, generally that leads to better things. So there's better. And so again, that's where the inherent right of the employer to say, come on back to the office exists. We're only talking in the accommodation phase, where we're saying, well, that can't happen. So now what are we going to do?
So true. Yeah, so true. And I'll stay away from kind of the opinion-based stuff, but it just does, again, we'll stay based on employment law here. But that's when it gets a little frustrating to me, when someone says remote from work works perfectly. Well,
Yeah.
no, it doesn't
No,
work
no.
perfectly.
There's a reason why we weren't doing it for the 20 years before the pandemic.
Exactly. Anyway, JD, I think you're going to kick off topic number 3. And a reminder, by the way, before we launch into this, if you got a question, we're coming up to that interactive portion. But topic number 3 is addressing performance and discipline issues. And JD, you're going to start on this. And I think the basic starting point is, when someone's working remote, there's less supervision. But take it away, JD.
Yeah, and that's, really the core message we're going to get to. We're lawyers, so we're going to talk about it at greater length than it probably requires. But the core message here is really that, yeah, you still have the right, obviously, to do performance management and discipline. It's just an increasing challenge in terms of the lack of in-person supervision. It's no different. The duty is no different. The right is no different. But it may take longer to notice somebody's got a performance issue. It's easier to conceal potentially if you're not, in person all the time. The George Costanza Seinfeld issue, where he built a little bed under his desk and was sleeping there. Well, if you're in the office, I might see that. I won't necessarily know about that at home. So there's a lot of different ways that you have to be creative about in terms of monitoring performance, shared knowledge, access, exposure, et cetera. And it's really more an evidence issue. It's really more noticing it that really engages a lot of what we see in terms of performance and misconduct issues. If your job is to be on a laptop for 8 hours a day and you're only logged in for 2 hours, okay, now we've got something we need to talk about or can talk about. Or if you notice it during the day, you're trying to reach this employee and you cannot reach them, and you've got, a hierarchy set up, like, we'll communicate by email, or we'll communicate by text, or here's how we're gonna communicate. But if it's urgent, I expect to see you in a text, respond to me. Well, 5 minutes is fine. If the employee doesn't respond to you for 3 hours, they may owe you an explanation. That starts to engage it. And it's a little more difficult when you're not walking around the office and you can't see people, but the rights are still there. It's just a more difficult issue in terms of noticing it, maybe easier to conceal for longer, et cetera. Negeen's going to talk a bit about, setting the employees up for success, and also some of the recruitment challenges, that may be unique to dealing with employees who are going to be remote, et cetera. But
Yeah, certainly. You want to set yourself up as an employer for success, being able to communicate with employees who are working remotely. And you also want to set the employees up for success. That might look like really setting clear expectations, clear deadlines, implementing kind of structured check-ins, whatever makes sense for the employer, if it's daily or weekly. You really just don't want to lose that line of communication. And you want to assess whether your communication methods are usable, practical, accessible. So kind of implementing as many different communication options as possible. And really, to the extent possible, you just want to stay on top of performance management as you would if the employees were in the workplace. Obviously, as JD mentioned, it's a bit more challenging, but to the extent possible, stay on top of it, address and document just like you would if they were in the workplace. And this is easier said than done, but really, we want to try to recruit team members that we can trust, particularly when we're not in the same workplace maybe as them on a day-to-day basis. We want that trusted and communication there, certainly.
Yeah. And one of the things we saw a bit during the pandemic, especially, was performance issues that went unaddressed. And they didn't go unaddressed because they went unnoticed. They didn't go unaddressed because of lack of motivation to do it. But what you saw during the pandemic in many cases was recruitment was very difficult. And so employers were very reluctant in some circumstances to speak out and to engage with employees on discipline and performance issues, simply because they were worried they'd lose them and they didn't want to have to replace them, and they didn't feel they could replace them. And so again, as an individual business, you have to assess what recruitment and retention impacts this may have on you. But as we know, and we've done seminars on this in the past, in terms of discipline and performance management, nothing demotivates an organization and the good employees quicker than noticing an employee getting away with murder. So that's a balance that you have to conduct as an employer. That's the business reality that I don't deal with my office when you call me. I tell you your legal rights and some strategies and some things to consider. But at the end of the day, if you say, well, if I fire this employee, or if I discipline this employee, they're going to leave and they're key to my business, I absolutely can't live without them. Well, that's a business decision you have to make.
It demonstrates the complexity of this number 3, because this is really the coming together of the legal issues and the performance management issues,
Exactly.
which kind of leaves employment law. That's what makes your job really interesting, by the way, because you're partly kind of rules based, if I can put it that way,
Yep.
and you're partially an advisor. Listen, we
and
got
keep
some.
in mind, our job is very easy because I sit back in my office 100 miles away and tell you what I think you should do. You have to look somebody in the eyes and do it. That's very different.
Yeah, I got to mention that's the first Seinfeld reference we've ever had on one of these. So, okay,
That's
listen,
the old school one.
Yeah, we're going to move to the Q&A session,
Okay.
because we've got some good questions here, and some of them are fairly complex. So we'll as always, please understand that JD and Negeen didn't have these questions in advance, and they didn't have their research department spend 5 hours looking them up. So we'll try to keep the answers, of course, accurate, but kind of high level.
Oh, you wanted accurate?
Yeah,
you didn't mention that. You didn't mention that earlier.
Right. Okay, our friends from Real Strategy, I'm going to put this one on the screen, say, how possible or legal is it to have some policies that apply to some people and not others? That's a really cool question. So you have a workforce, there's all sorts of jobs, and these rules apply to these people, and these rules apply to those ones. JD, do you want to?
In certain circumstances, that can be entirely valid, because you may have a component of you may have a component of a business that is production. You have people working on a production line, putting things together. Well, obviously there was a different remote work consideration for those people than accounts payable, accounts receivable, sales, for example. So it's certainly possible you can have those separate. That doesn't necessarily create an inherent problem. If it creates a discriminatory issue, then obviously that's something you have to consider. If there's various arguments that can be made when you get the facts all together and say, this is risky. Okay, but certainly, you can certainly respond to the differences in your business, the differences in the employee base of your business, maybe even difference in locations. You may have multiple locations, and there may be one that sets up well for it and one that doesn't set up well for it. Your policies can be that specific, but again, you have to watch whether it veers into the discriminatory or anything like that can create that kind of issue for you.
Yeah, so it might be defensible treating different employees differently, but it depends on some circumstances. Anything to add to that, Negeen? I'm not putting you on the spot.
No, that was exactly the first thought I had, Michael, is just be careful that you're not kind of adversely impacting a certain group of employees based on ground.
Okay.
And I
Okay.
should note that's exactly what I would have heard from Negeen if I ran down to her office to ask her the answer to this question.
Hey,
It's what I
Nikki, what should I
usually do.
say?
Yeah.
Okay, here's one I'm sure some employees are hearing from. So we all know we're living in an inflationary environment, and if you're bringing people back to the office, they're going to talk about the commute, and we've already seen that in the news, talking about LRT and buses, or on the flip side for the drivers out there, oh my God, the cost of gas is so much. So if someone comes to you, maybe Negeen will start off with you on this one, and says, hey boss, I can't come back to the office. I can't afford to do it. The gas cost weekly is going to cost me $100 a week. What would you tell that person, Negeen?
This is an interesting one. I'm not sure I've seen it, but again, we'll have to remember that 4, 5, 6 years ago, we were commuting to the workplace. It was something we were kind of adding to the daily routine of getting up, and it was kind of one of the, you got to get to work. And so certainly, if just like JD mentioned, we'll have to take a look at what are the essential duties of the employee. Is it what are the requirements? But my gut reaction initially is that really that's the employee's job to get themselves to work and perform their duties.
Yeah.
Like inflation has happened in the past when we haven't had a pandemic.
Yeah.
Right. So costs do increase, gas prices skyrocket, things happen, and that doesn't necessarily change the fundamentals of the workplace and the requirement to attend the office. What you'll see it obviously addressed in collective bargaining in a unionized environment. You may see it addressed when you go to hire a new employee and you can't get them for the price you used to be able to get them for. But
great point.
that's the element of the business that you have to adjust to. If your competitors are paying more and getting better people, you're going to have to consider whether that adjustment is worth it, or you're not able to recruit and retain, et cetera. Then you've got an issue you have to address from a strictly legal standpoint. Just because your costs of living have gone up, you moved to a bigger house with a higher mortgage, you chose to do this, you chose to buy a cottage during the pandemic, and your costs are gone up. There's a lot of things people do, adjustments in their personal life. We pay what we pay for the job.
Yeah. I like your point on this. It might be less of an employment issue and more of a compensation solution, right? Which is, I can't afford to go. Okay, well, when we're having a compensation issue, it doesn't mean you don't have the right not to come to the office.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Our friends at Real Strategy have another question that I thought was particularly interesting. And I've heard this one before. And there's all sorts of layers. This always is to these questions. But is the fact that an employee moved away and bought a house relevant as a need to accommodate, especially if the house sale would now result in a loss? So let's assume that the employee went off on their own and bought that house. It didn't necessarily have the employer's permission. I don't know, JD, what would your initial thoughts be on this? You probably need so many more details that it's hard to answer.
My initial thoughts you'd have to censor, but I've dealt with this issue. I've had lots of employers calling me and saying, one of my employees moved to Kingston.
Yeah.
And I said, okay. And now they got to come back.
Yeah.
And they said, well, they don't want to because it's going to be expensive and they might take a loss on their house because they bought at the peak. Well, we all make life choices, and some of them turn out really well for us, and some of them do not turn out well at all. And that's really at the root of it. Again, barring accommodation, they mentioned accommodation in their question, and again, there's no financial accommodation in the codes in the human rights legislation. So it's, as a base answer, no. Again, as a recruitment retention answer, as a, those types of issues, another issue entirely. But from a strictly legal rights standpoint, because you made those decisions, and again, you have to go back to, did I put something out there in the workplace that gave rise to you thinking you'd never have to come back again? Well, that's a separate thing that we have to talk about. But if I never made any of those assurances to you and you just made a lifestyle choice, well, you made a lifestyle choice. And if there's a cost and a problem with it, off you go.
Yeah.
I hear you.
No, we really want to remember. Oh, sorry, Michael.
Yeah, go ahead.
We really want to remember that when it comes to the duty to accommodate, there's not a duty to accommodate any and all requests by employees, right? We
Yes.
want to turn our mind back
Yeah.
to what
Exactly.
the legislation says. And I think in Ontario, there's a list of kind of maybe 17 or 18 protected grounds, and unless it falls under one of those, and there's other considerations we may have to take, but as JD said, kind of the initial reaction is that doesn't fall under one of the protected grounds. We'd have to take a look, but it's only those that we have to
Yeah.
accommodate to the point of undue hardship.
Short answer, it starts with an F and ends with no.
Okay. Listen, we've had such a vibrant discussion here. We're well into overtime. There were a couple other questions. I will remind our viewers that we will share contact information for both JD and Negeen afterwards. So if you got a question, I'm sure they'd be happy to speak with you about it. We're going to move into our takeaways conclusion section. JD, I think you're going to take the lead. We'll bring that slide up on screen, and we'll start wrapping up.
Yeah. So again, the takeaways, again, subject to any contractual agreements or any commitments that have been made in a collective agreement, in an employment agreement, or even, just the employer putting something out there to everybody. Working from home is a privilege, not a right. You have the right to bring your employees back to work and require them to do so. Working from home may be required as part of the duty to accommodate, again, but it has to engage one of the grounds in the Human Rights Code. It can't just be I'd prefer. If you hear I'd prefer, usually we have a problem. If it's a medical issue, somebody's claiming, disability based, they can't come in, get the medical and do your normal accommodation analysis as you would with anybody. Same thing with family status or any other one of the grounds that may be engaged. You still do the analysis. It may not engage that ground. If it does, then you have to look at it. And performance management, again, to the extent, the risks and the problems that are set up by remote work are primarily based in observance, increased ability to conceal, and perhaps a more difficult time kind of setting metrics. But if you've got metrics and key performance indicators and all those types of things, uh, if you can monitor them, it doesn't matter whether I'm online or whether I'm in the office.
We're going to bring up your contact info here on screen. One of the things when you guys were talking that really kind of was emphasized is a lot of this discussion was, well, depends, what your contract said, depends what was communicated to you. People should be contacting you looking forward, not always looking backwards, right? So,
Yeah.
so when you're creating your policies, when
Yes.
you're creating these employment contracts, hey, do yourself a favor and get some really solid legal advice, right, JD?
I generally find that people don't like spending quality time with me. And I should make clear this includes my family, but it's, a 5-minute phone call now,
Yeah.
or 10 to 20 hours with me later.
Yeah.
Generally, people, if they had the chance to go back, would take the 5-minute phone call.
Seriously, right? Nagina, I'm sure you find this too.
Yes,
Like if
yeah.
someone would have got some good advice before they, drafted that post-pandemic employment law agreement, you could
Yep.
have resolved a lot of these issues before
Yeah.
they blew up in your face.
No, for sure. One of the things I love about working with employers is we can be proactive. We can get ahead of the issues to
Yeah.
the extent possible, and so we really want to make sure we're being proactive on these issues.
Yeah. Maybe as we just wrap up, one quick thought to you, JD, one quick question to you. So, I just want to make sure people are picking up on the right tone in this discussion. So, I think when we're talking about employment law, especially from a management point of view, we're not trying to say employees are bad, they need to be
No,
controlled. This
no.
is really about establishing the
Yeah.
rights
Yeah.
of employers and making sure you have a basis from which to make a good decision for a valued employee. Is that right, JD?
Yeah, the one thing I've learned over this 27 years I've been doing this is that every business is different.
Yeah.
Even two businesses in the same business are different. Their people are different. Their management style is different. Their philosophy is different. And my job when they call me is to give legal advice, advise them as to their rights, advise them as to strategies, advise them as to options. At the end of the day, these people have created successful businesses or are running a successful operation, not because I'm around.
Yeah.
They're running it because they've run it, and so they have to take into account their own considerations. We help you set the baseline and the understanding of the parameters within which you operate, before you'll step outside of those and create a real problem for yourself. But once you get into that, the business decision has to be theirs, and it is theirs. And I will never know as much about one of my clients' businesses as they know, and that's the key thing, is that we give them that information, and then and we're happy to go back and talk about the strategies as they go along or things as they arise. But ultimately, yeah, we're not talking employers are bad or employees are bad.
Yeah.
Now, by nature of my business, I tend to deal with the bottom 2 to 3% of employees, because that's who I get called about. I don't often get calls from employers to terminate their best employee.
Yeah.
So you can get into that mindset a little bit, but the idea really for us is to help you set the parameters, and then you got to operate your business within those parameters. That's the idea.
Setting Negeen, I think, had a phrase, setting the conditions of success. So I think that's that's
Yeah,
what we're trying to do
perfect.
here too. It's not about being negative and punitive
No.
and all that type of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
JD, Negeen, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been wonderful chatting with you again. I really want to thank you for your time. Thanks for
Thank
being
you for
here.
having us.
Yes, thanks so much,
Always
Michael.
fun.
Okay. All right. That was JD Sharp and Negeen Yazdani. I got to remind everyone, if you go to Ottawa Business Journal on YouTube, there's a complete playlist of these employment law videos. I really encourage you to check them out. They're going to answer a lot of your questions kind of at that high level. And then, as I always do, I urge you to reach out to get some professional advice. Listen, I want to remind also all of you, you can visit obj.ca website every day for the latest in local news. I highly recommend you subscribe to OBJ Today, and you can follow us on social media. LinkedIn tends to be very popular. I think we're almost at 40,000 followers. And since you're on YouTube, please click the red subscribe button and the little bell icon. If you do that, you will be notified about any other videos or live broadcasts. That's all the time we have for today. On behalf of our friends at Emond, Harnden, and OBJ, thanks for tuning in. See you, everyone. Bye-bye.